The eviction notice had been taped to their door for 3 days now, its edges curling in the humid Georgia heat like a dying flower wilting against the peeling paint of what had been home for longer than most people lived anywhere. Harold Peterson sat on the sagging porch steps that he'd repaired at least a dozen times over the decades, watching Sheriff's Deputy Williams hammer the final nail into the bright orange foreclosure sign. The sound echoed across the quiet neighborhood like gunshots, each blow driving deeper than just into the bark of the old oak tree that had shaded his front yard since before Harold was even born. Before we explore this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. At 73, Harold's hands were spotted with liver marks and twisted with arthritis that made every morning a negotiation between his body and his will. But today they shook with something far beyond physical frailty. They trembled with a rage so pure and deep it threatened to choke him, mixed with a disbelief that felt like drowning in slow motion. This was the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from fighting a system designed not just to ignore you, but to grind you down until you disappeared entirely. The deputy avoided eye contact as he gathered his tools. Harold had known Tom Williams since the boy was knee-high to a grasshopper, had built the cabinets in Tom's first apartment, had attended his wedding to Sarah Mitchell from down the street. Now Tom was here in his official capacity, carrying out orders from people who lived in glass towers and had never held a hammer in their lives. "I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson," Tom mumbled as he walked past. "I really am." Harold wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that sorry didn't pay the bills or put a roof over their heads, but the words stuck in his throat like splinters. What was the point? Tom was just doing his job, following orders from the bank that had decided 47 years of on-time payments didn't matter anymore. Not when medical bills from Harold's heart attack had forced them to refinance their home at 70 years old, and certainly not when the adjustable rate had jumped to nearly 8%, just as Harold's disability payments got cut. Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him, moving with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested every step. She was 68, her silver hair still thick and beautiful despite everything they'd been through, her blue eyes still sharp as winter mornings. But today those eyes carried a weariness that Harold had never seen before. Not even during their son Michael's funeral 8 years ago. At least then they'd had their grief, and each other, and a home to grieve in. Today, they had each other, and not much else. In her arms, she cradled a cardboard box that contained what the bank had determined they could keep: photo albums, wrapped in newspaper to protect them from the humidity, her grandmother's china teacups, the ones that had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars, Harold's Purple Heart, from Vietnam, still in its original case, and a handful of documents that proved they had once mattered to someone, somewhere. Birth certificates, marriage license, the deed to the house that was no longer theirs, insurance papers for policies they could no longer afford. "That's everything from the bedroom," she said quietly, setting the box down beside Harold's worn work boots. "They said we could come back tomorrow for anything else, but," she gestured helplessly at the house they'd poured their lives into, "what else was there to take? The furniture they'd bought piece by piece over decades of marriage, the bank owned that now. The workshop out back where Harold had built custom cabinets and furniture for half the county, the new owners could deal with that." Harold looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw the weight of defeat settling into her shoulders like snow accumulating on a roof that was already straining under too much pressure. Margaret had always been the strong one, the one who found solutions when Harold could only see problems. She'd been the one to suggest refinancing when his heart attack left them drowning in medical debt. She'd been the one to cut coupons and stretch every dollar until it screamed. She'd been the one to call their daughter in California and gently explain why they wouldn't be visiting for Christmas anymore. But today, for the first time since Harold had known her, Margaret looked beaten. 47 years, Harold muttered, watching Deputy Williams' patrol car disappear down Maple Street. 47 years we paid every bill, every tax, every damn fee they asked for, never missed a payment until, he trailed off, not wanting to say it out loud. Until the heart attack that had started with chest pain during Sunday service and ended with 6 days in the ICU and medical bills that cost more than their house had when they'd first bought it. Margaret eased herself down beside him, on the step they'd sat on together thousands of times over the decades. This was where they'd watched their children take their first steps, where they'd snapped photos before prom and graduation, where they'd held each other the night the army chaplain came to tell them about Michael. "For this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "so we could sit here together on our last day and remember what we built." The neighborhood around them was changing, had been changing for years. Young families with good jobs moving in, buying up the old houses and tearing them down to build something bigger, something modern, something that didn't carry the scars and stories of previous generations. Harold and Margaret had become relics in their own community, reminders of a time when people stayed in one place their whole lives, when a handshake meant something, when your word was your bond. The truth was simple and brutal as winter rain. They had nowhere to go. Their daughter, Lisa, lived in San Diego with her husband and 2 teenagers, struggling to pay their own mortgage and save for college tuition. She'd offered to let them come stay, of course, but Harold had heard the strain in her voice during their last phone conversation. Lisa's husband had been laid off 6 months ago, and they were barely hanging on themselves. Adding 2 elderly in-laws to the mix would break them financially and probably emotionally too. Their son Michael would have taken them in without a second thought, would have driven his truck down from Atlanta and loaded up their belongings himself. But Michael had been dead for 8 years, killed by an improvised explosive device on a road outside Kandahar, Afghanistan. His room was exactly as he'd left it, the day he shipped out baseball trophies on the dresser, high school yearbooks on the shelf, a poster of Dale Earnhardt on the wall. But Michael himself was buried in the Veterans Cemetery 40 miles away, under a white marble headstone that read, "Beloved Son and Patriot." Social Security provided them with $1,346 a month, between the 2 of them barely enough to cover their medications, let alone rent in a decent neighborhood. The assisted living facilities they'd visited had deposit requirements that might as well have been asking for the moon. At their age, with their limited income and medical histories, they'd become invisible to a rental market that wanted young professionals with steady incomes and clean credit reports. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Harold of Margaret's cheeks on their wedding day, she pulled a wrinkled envelope from her purse. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing 5 $20 bills, crisp hundreds, that had been their emergency fund, now reduced to everything they had left in the world. "We could get a motel room for a few nights," she said, her voice carrying the kind of forced optimism that fooled nobody. "That place out by the interstate, it's not fancy, but it's clean." Harold shook his head, feeling the weight of every one of his 73 years pressing down on his shoulders. "And then what? We can't live in motels forever, Maggie. $100 might buy us 4 nights if we're lucky, and then we're right back where we started. Except Broca." They sat in silence as the evening deepened around them, watching fireflies begin their ancient dance across the yard. Margaret had tended with the devotion of a mother, caring for children. She'd planted the rose bushes by the front gate when Lisa was born, had added the herb garden when Michael started walking, had spent countless hours weeding and watering and nurturing this little patch of earth into something beautiful. Tomorrow, strangers would live here. They'd probably rip out the roses and plant something modern, something that required less care. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 50 years of marriage and all the dreams that were ending with the setting sun. Harold found himself remembering something his grandfather had told him as a boy, back when the old man was dying, and Harold was young enough to think death was something that happened to other people. They'd been sitting on his grandfather's porch, not so different from this one, and the old man had looked out at his own yard, with eyes that held too much sorrow for one lifetime. "Sometimes when the world kicks you down, boy," his grandfather had said in his whiskey, rough voice, "you got to find a place it forgot to look. There's always somewhere, always some corner that got overlooked by all the people with their plans and their papers. You just got to be brave enough to claim it." Harold had been 13 then and hadn't understood what his grandfather meant. Now, at 73, and facing homelessness for the first time in his life, the words came back to him with the clarity of divine revelation. He turned to Margaret, who was staring at their house like she was trying to memorize every detail before they had to leave it forever. "Maggie," he said softly, "what do you know about abandoned places?" She looked at him strangely. "What do you mean?" "I mean houses that nobody wants anymore. Places that are too run down or too far out for anyone to bother with. There's got to be somewhere we could go, somewhere we could stay while we figure things out." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Harold could see her mind working behind her eyes. It was the same look she'd gotten when they were young and poor, and she'd figured out how to stretch a pound of hamburger into 3 meals. "I remember stories," she said finally, "from back when I was working at the county clerk's office. People would come in asking about property taxes on places their grandparents had owned, places that had been sitting empty for decades. Some of them, the taxes had been paid by lawyers' offices, but nobody had lived there in years." Harold felt a spark of something that might have been hope. "You think we could find something like that?" "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that we don't have any other choice." The next morning dawned gray and humid, the kind of Georgia weather that made everything feel sticky and oppressive. Harold loaded their remaining possessions into his 1998 Ford pickup truck, a vehicle that had been old when he bought it and was now held together by prayer, stubbornness, and liberal applications of duct tape. The truck had over 200,000 miles on it, but it still ran, mostly, and it was paid for, which was more than he could say for most things in his life. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with a stack of maps she'd found in the glove compartment, county road maps from back when people used paper instead of GPS. She'd also brought a thermos of coffee and 2 bologna sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil, their breakfast and lunch, since they couldn't afford to stop at restaurants. "Where to?" Harold asked as he turned the key and listened to the engine cough to life. Margaret unfolded one of the maps across her lap. "South," she said. "Away from the interstate, away from the towns that are growing, somewhere time forgot about." They drove for over 2 hours on increasingly narrow roads that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. They passed collapsed tobacco barns with rusted tin roofs, overgrown fields where cotton had once grown in endless white waves, and farmhouses that sat empty with broken windows staring out like dead eyes. This was the Georgia that tourists never saw, the parts that had been left behind when the New South rose from the ashes of the old. The trees grew thicker as they drove deeper into the countryside, ancient pines and oaks, whose branches had grown together overhead to form a canopy so dense that the sunlight filtered through in scattered golden coins. Spanish moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the air that drifted through the truck's open windows carried the scent of honeysuckle and something older, something wild and untamed, that spoke of a time before roads and power lines and the march of progress. This was old Georgia, forgotten Georgia, where time moved like molasses in January and secrets stayed buried under layers of kudzu and silence. The kind of place where a family could disappear and nobody would think to look for them, where the past lingered like morning fog that never quite burned off. That's when they saw it. Harold almost missed the turnoff. What had once been a grand driveway was now little more than 2 parallel ruts through grass that came up to the truck's windows. The entrance was marked by 2 massive stone pillars, crumbling and vine-covered, but still standing after more than a century and a half. Between them hung the rusted remains of an iron gate, hanging open on broken hinges like a mouth frozen in a permanent yawn. "Stop," Margaret said suddenly, pointing. "Look at that." Set back from the road by nearly half a mile, barely visible through the tunnel of overhanging branches, stood the remains of what had clearly been a plantation house. Even from a distance, even through the green curtain of neglect, Harold could see that it was massive, 3 stories of white columns and wraparound galleries that spoke of wealth and power from a time when both had been built on the backs of enslaved people. Harold guided the truck through the broken gate and up the overgrown driveway, branches scraping against the sides like skeletal fingers trying to pull them back. With every yard they traveled, the house grew larger and more imposing, rising from the Georgia wilderness like something from a dream or a nightmare. A faded sign, barely readable through decades of weather and neglect, read, "Whitmore Plantation, Est. 1827. Below that, in smaller letters that Harold had to squint to make out, "Private property, no trespassing." "Jesus," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with something between awe and fear. "Look at the size of it." The house was indeed massive, but it was beautiful too, in the way that ruined things sometimes are proud and broken, and somehow still standing despite everything time and weather and human indifference had thrown at it. The white paint was peeling from the columns like old skin, and vines had claimed the lower walls with the relentless patience of nature, reclaiming what had always belonged to it. But the roof was intact, the windows were still in their frames, and the bones of the structure looked solid. Harold pulled the truck to a stop in what had once been a circular drive, now overgrown with grass and weeds that came up to their knees. For a long moment, they just sat there with the engine ticking as it cooled, staring up at the house that loomed over them like a monument to a dead civilization. "What do you think?" Harold asked finally. Margaret was quiet for a moment, studying the house with the same careful attention she'd once given to their monthly budget when money was tight and bills were due. "I think," she said slowly, "that nobody's lived here in a very long time. Maybe nobody even remembers it's here." Harold felt that spark of hope growing brighter in his chest. If the house was truly abandoned, if it had been forgotten by whatever bank or government agency was supposed to be keeping track of such things, then maybe, just maybe, they could stay here long enough to figure out what to do next. It wasn't stealing, he told himself. It was survival. They approached the house on foot, their steps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves that had been accumulating for years. Up close, the plantation house was even more imposing than it had seemed from the road. The front steps, carved from gray granite that must have cost a fortune to quarry and transport in the 1800s, led up to double doors that stood nearly 10 feet tall. The windows on the first floor were shuttered with heavy wooden panels, but through gaps in the wood, Harold could catch glimpses of rooms thick with shadows and dust. Harold tried the front door first, turning the massive brass handle with hands that shook slightly with anticipation and fear. Locked, of course. The door was solid oak, heavy enough to stop a battering ram, and probably old enough to be considered an antique in its own right. But Margaret, who had always been more practical than her husband, was already walking around the side of the house, looking for another way in. She'd been the one to suggest they check the abandoned house in the first place, and she was the one who would find them a way inside if there was one to be found. "Harold," she called from somewhere around back. "Come here." Harold followed the sound of her voice around the house, past overgrown gardens where roses had gone wild and jasmine vines had claimed entire walls. The back of the house faced what had once been formal gardens but was now a jungle of uncontrolled growth. And there, in a section where the foundation had shifted slightly over the decades, was what Margaret had found: a door where the wood had warped just enough that it no longer fit properly in its frame. "Give me a hand," she said, already pushing against the door with her shoulder. Together, they managed to force the door open, the swollen wood groaning in protest before finally giving way with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. The door swung inward, revealing darkness that seemed to have weight and substance. The smell hit them first, dust and mildew, and the sweet decay of wood slowly returning to earth, mixed with the mustiness of fabric and paper that had been sitting undisturbed for decades. But underneath all of that was something else, something clean and dry, that suggested the house hadn't been abandoned as completely as it appeared from the outside. Harold pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, a habit from his construction days, and played the beam across the room they'd entered. It was a kitchen, but not like any kitchen he'd ever seen. The room was enormous, easily 30 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above their heads. The cabinets were handmade from what looked like heart pine, their surfaces aged to a warm honey color that spoke of centuries of careful craftsmanship. Though the brass hardware had turned green with age, everything still looked functional. An enormous cast-iron stove dominated one wall, the kind that had been used to cook for large households back when plantations had housed dozens of people, family members, servants, and the enslaved workers who had made places like this possible. Margaret ran her hand along the stove's surface, surprised to find it clean beneath the layer of dust. "Harold," she called softly, her voice strange in the empty house. "Look at this." She was standing beside what might have been the largest kitchen table Harold had ever seen, a massive slab of wood that could easily have seated 12 people for dinner. But what had caught Margaret's attention wasn't the table itself. It was what sat on top of it. An oil lamp, its glass chimney clean and the wick trimmed as if someone had been using it recently. Beside the lamp was a book, lying face down and open, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and would be back shortly to continue reading. Harold approached the table cautiously, his flashlight beam playing across the open pages. The book was old but well preserved, bound in leather that had aged to the color of dark chocolate. He could make out the title embossed in faded gold letters, A History of Antebellum Architecture in the American South. Margaret peered over his shoulder as Harold carefully lifted the book and read the chapter heading, Hidden Spaces and Secret Rooms. The Architecture of Concealment in Southern Plantation Houses. They looked at each other in the dim light of Harold's flashlight, both thinking the same thing. Someone had been here recently, maybe not yesterday, maybe not even last week, but certainly not years ago. Someone had been reading this specific book, studying this specific chapter, for reasons that neither of them could fathom. "We should go," Margaret whispered, but even as she said it, Harold could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Should we?" Harold asked. "Maggie, we don't have anywhere else to go. And whoever was here, they're not here now." But Harold was already moving deeper into the house, drawn by something he couldn't name, curiosity, maybe, or desperation, or simply the need to understand what they'd stumbled into. The flashlight, the beam revealed doorways leading to other rooms, and beyond those, a main hallway that stretched away into darkness like the throat of some enormous beast. The hallway was even more impressive than the kitchen. The ceiling rose 12 feet above their heads, decorated with elaborate plaster molding that spoke of a time when people built houses to last centuries, not decades. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper in a pattern that might once have been burgundy but had aged to the color of dried blood. Portrait frames hung at regular intervals, though the paintings themselves were too dark to make out in the flashlight beam. "This place must be worth a fortune," Margaret whispered. Harold nodded, but he was thinking about something else. If the house was worth so much money, why was it sitting here abandoned? Why hadn't some developer bought it and turned it into a hotel or event venue? Why hadn't the state or federal government claimed it as a historical site? They moved through the house like ghosts, their footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that, despite everything, were still solid beneath their feet. They found a formal dining room with a table that could have seated 20, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves still filled with leather-bound volumes, and a parlor with furniture covered in white sheets like sleeping spirits. But it was in the main hallway, at the foot of a grand staircase that curved up toward the second floor like something from a movie, that Harold made the discovery that would change everything. Mounted on the wall was a portrait in an ornate gold frame, showing a man in his 50s wearing the formal clothing of the 1800s. His eyes were dark and intense, and there was something about his expression that seemed almost alive, as if he were watching them explore his house from beyond the grave. Below the portrait was a small brass plaque that read, Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore, 1821 to 1874, master of Whitmore Plantation. But what caught Harold's attention wasn't the portrait itself, it was what he noticed when he looked closely at the wall around it. The wallpaper was old and faded, but there, just visible in the flashlight beam, was something that didn't belong. A vertical line that ran from floor to ceiling, hidden behind the portrait but still faintly visible if you knew what to look for, a seam in the wall. Harold's heart began to pound as he ran his fingers along the edge of the portrait frame. The frame was heavier than he'd expected, and when he pressed against it experimentally, it moved slightly, not like a picture hanging on a wall, but like something mounted on hinges. "Margaret," he called, his voice barely above a whisper, "come here." She joined him at the portrait, and together they examined the wall more carefully. Harold's construction background had taught him to notice things that other people missed. And what he was seeing now didn't make sense unless he found what he was looking for, hidden behind the frame's elaborate scrollwork, a small metal latch, nearly invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. When he pressed it, something clicked deep within the wall, and the entire section, portrait and all, swung inward like a door. Behind it was darkness, so complete it seemed to have weight and substance, and the smell that drifted up from below was different from the rest of the house. Cooler, drier, carrying hints of something that Harold couldn't identify, but that made his pulse quicken. Stone steps led down into the darkness, disappearing beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. Margaret grabbed his arm. "Harold, no. We don't know what's down there." But Harold was already moving toward the opening, his flashlight playing across stone walls that looked much older than the house above. "Just a quick look," he said. "If there's anything valuable down there, maybe we could." He paused, not sure how to finish the sentence. Trade it for time? Sell it to buy themselves a few more weeks of survival? He wasn't sure, but something was pulling him toward those stairs, with a force he couldn't resist. 5 minutes, Margaret said finally. 5 minutes, and then we get out of here." The staircase wasn't long, maybe 20 steps, but Harold felt like they were descending much farther than that. Like they were moving backward through time itself. The stone walls wept with moisture despite the dry air, and their footsteps echoed in the narrow space like the beating of an ancient heart. At the bottom, Harold's flashlight beam revealed a room that stole what little breath he had left. It was circular, maybe 15 feet across, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above their heads. The walls were lined with wooden shelves and glass cases, and on those shelves were objects that, even in the dim light of his flashlight, Harold could see were extraordinary. Books bound in leather so fine it looked like silk. Rolled documents tied with ribbons that might once have been red but had faded to the color of rust. Small statues, carved from ivory and jade and woods, that gleamed like jewels in the flashlight beam. Weapons that looked like they belonged in museums, swords and pistols and daggers, with handles wrapped in precious metals. But what drew their attention immediately was the glass case in the center of the room. It was about the size of a dining table. And inside, cushioned on faded velvet, lay what was unmistakably a sword. But this wasn't any ordinary weapon, it was ornate beyond anything Harold had ever seen. The blade gleaming like silver, and the handle wrapped in gold wire, set with stones that caught his flashlight beam and threw it back in rainbow fragments. Margaret leaned closer to the case, squinting at a small placard inside. "Harold, shine the light here." The placard was written in faded brown ink, but the words were still legible. "Presented to Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore by General Robert E. Lee, 1863. In recognition of extraordinary service to the Confederacy." Harold let out a low whistle that echoed in the stone chamber. "That's gotta be worth something." But as they explored the room further, moving their flashlight beam from shelf to shelf and case to case, they realized that the sword was just the beginning. This wasn't just a storage room or even a display case for family heirlooms. This was a treasure vault, filled with objects that looked like they belonged in the world's greatest museums. There were paintings wrapped in oiled cloth, their ornate frames visible at the edges. There There were chests that looked heavy enough to require multiple strong men to move. There were artifacts that seemed to span centuries of collecting Native American pottery and weapons, European art objects that gleamed with precious metals, books that looked so old and fragile that Harold was afraid to breathe on them. And in the far corner, stacked like cordwood, were what looked like small gold bars. Harold picked one up, surprised by its weight. It was about the size of a smartphone, but felt like it weighed 10 pounds. There was writing on it, pressed into the metal in a script he couldn't read, but the dull gleam of the metal in his flashlight beam left no doubt about what it was. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think we just found more than a place to live." But even as he said it, Harold felt the weight of what they'd discovered, settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just valuable, this was historically significant. These were artifacts that belonged in museums, objects that scholars would give their careers to study, treasures that raised more questions than they answered. Who was Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore, and how had he accumulated such an extraordinary collection? Why had he hidden it away in this underground room? And most importantly, what were two homeless elderly people supposed to do with a discovery that could be worth more money than they'd ever imagined? As Harold's flashlight beam grew dimmer, a reminder that even the best batteries didn't last forever, he and Margaret made their way back up the stone stairs to the main house. Harold closed the secret door behind them, making sure the latch caught properly, and they stood in the hallway looking at the portrait of Colonel Whitmore, as if seeing him for the first time. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked. Harold was quiet for a long moment, thinking. They could leave, pretend they'd never found this place, or seen what was hidden beneath it. They could drive away and continue looking for somewhere else to stay, somewhere that didn't come with the weight of hidden treasures and unanswered questions. But as he looked around the plantation house at the solid walls and intact roof, at the rooms that were larger than their entire former home, at the isolation that would give them time to think and plan, Harold made a decision that would change the rest of their lives. "We stay," he said finally. "At least for tonight. Maybe longer." "Harold," Margaret began, but he cut her off gently. "Maggie, we don't have anywhere else to go. This place is shelter, it's got running water, and nobody's been here in months. As for what we found downstairs," he gestured toward the portrait, "we'll figure that out tomorrow." That night, they slept on air mattresses in what had once been the plantation's master bedroom, their few possessions scattered around them like the remnants of a life that was ending and another that was beginning. The house groaned and settled around them, speaking in the ancient language of old wood and older memories. Outside, the Georgia night was full of sounds they'd forgotten, existed owls calling to each other across the darkness, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth, the distant sound of water running over stones. It was peaceful in a way that their suburban neighborhood had never been, as if the isolation that made the place seem abandoned also protected it from the chaos of the modern world. Harold lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the room beneath them. Every instinct he had told him that what they'd found was important, valuable beyond their ability to comprehend. But he'd also lived long enough to know that finding treasure and keeping it were two entirely different things. As sleep finally began to claim him, Harold thought about Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore and the portrait that had led them to the hidden vault. What kind of man accumulated such wealth and then hid it away from the world? What kind of secrets had he been protecting, and what kind of responsibility had Harold and Margaret inherited, along with their desperate need for shelter? Tomorrow, he decided, they would start looking for answers. But tonight, for the first time in months, they would sleep without worrying about where they'd wake up. Harold woke to the sound of rain pattering against windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in decades. Gray morning light filtered through the grime like sunlight through deep water, casting everything in the master bedroom in shades of silver and shadow. Margaret was still asleep beside him on the air mattress, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been since before the foreclosure notice arrived. For a moment, Harold allowed himself to forget where they were and why they were there. This could have been any morning in any house they'd ever called home. But then reality crept back in, along with the memory of what they'd discovered beneath their feet just hours before. He dressed quietly in yesterday's clothes, all they had left, and made his way downstairs, stepping carefully on floorboards that announced his every movement with creaks and groans that echoed through the empty house like conversations between ghosts. In the kitchen, he discovered that the old cast-iron stove was connected to a propane tank that, miraculously, still had gas in it. When he turned the tap at the deep porcelain sink, water ran rust-colored for nearly a minute before clearing to something that looked drinkable. It tasted of iron and earth, but it was water, and whoever had been here before them had left more than just a book and an oil lamp. They'd left the basic infrastructure for survival. Harold made coffee, using bottled water from their truck, and sat at the enormous kitchen table, watching the rain streak down windows that looked out onto what had once been carefully manicured gardens. Now roses and jasmine had gone wild, climbing over stone benches and wrapping around the iron framework of what might have been a gazebo. The coffee tasted better than any he'd had in months, maybe because it was the first cup he'd enjoyed, without worrying about whether they could afford the next pound of grounds. Margaret appeared an hour later, drawn by the smell of coffee and the sound of Harold moving around. She looked rested despite their strange circumstances, and Harold realized that maybe he wasn't the only one who had slept better knowing they had a roof over their heads, even if that roof wasn't exactly legal. "Sleep okay?" he asked, offering her the cup he'd prepared. She nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic like it was a lifeline. "Better than I have in weeks. This place, she searched for the right word, looking around at the high ceilings and hand-carved moldings. Peaceful. Even with everything that's happened, even with what we found down there, it feels peaceful." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, both of them thinking about the room beneath the house and what it might mean for their future. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, and Harold found himself grateful for it. Rain meant they wouldn't be disturbed, meant they could explore without worrying about unexpected visitors. Finally, Harold stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the front grounds. Through the rain, he could see the outlines of other buildings scattered across the property, what looked like a carriage house, several smaller structures that might have been slave quarters, and something larger in the distance that was partially hidden by overgrown trees. "I want to explore more today," he said. "That room we found last night, it might not be the only one." Houses like this, they were built by people who had reasons to hide things. Margaret joined him at the window, following his gaze across the plantation grounds. "What do you think we'll find?" Harold was quiet for a moment, thinking about the careful way the secret room had been constructed, the quality of the artifacts they'd glimpsed in his flashlight beam. "I think," he said finally, "that Colonel Whitmore was more than just a wealthy plantation owner. I think he was a collector, someone who understood the value of preserving things that other people might have overlooked or destroyed." After breakfast, canned peaches and crackers from their emergency supplies, Harold retrieved his heavy-duty flashlight from the truck while Margaret explored the main floor of the house more thoroughly. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, but they decided to stay inside for now. There would be time to investigate the outbuildings later when the weather cleared and they had a better understanding of what they were dealing with. They returned to the secret room beneath the house, and in the stronger light of Harold's construction flashlight, the treasure vault was even more impressive than it had seemed the night before. The walls were lined with built-in shelves and cabinets, all of them crafted from the same rich wood as the house's main structure. Every surface was filled with objects that seemed to span centuries of careful collecting. "Look at this," Margaret said, examining a tall cabinet in the back corner of the room. "This doesn't sit flush against the wall." Harold joined her, playing his flashlight beam around the edges of the cabinet. She was right. There was a gap between the heavy piece of furniture and the stone wall behind it, as if it had been deliberately positioned to hide something. Together, they managed to slide the cabinet aside, revealing another door set into the wall. This door was different from the entrance they'd used to reach the main vault. It was older, cruder, carved from a single piece of oak and secured with an iron latch that looked like it had been forged by hand centuries ago. When Harold lifted the latch, the door opened with surprising ease, revealing not another room, but a tunnel. The passage was narrow. They would have to walk single file, and it stretched away from them into darkness that their flashlight couldn't penetrate. The walls were rough stone, not the carefully fitted blocks of the vault they'd come from, but something more primitive, older. "This has to predate the house," Harold said, running his hand along the uneven stone walls. "This is really old. Maybe older than the plantation itself." Margaret shivered despite the cool, dry air. "Where do you think it goes?" "Only one way to find out," Harold said, but his voice carried uncertainty. Every instinct told him that whatever lay at the end of this tunnel was significant, but he also understood that they were venturing into territory that might be beyond their ability to handle safely. They followed the tunnel for what felt like 100 yards, though in the disorienting darkness, it was impossible to judge distance accurately. The floor was uneven, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, and twice they had to duck under low-hanging stones that jutted from the ceiling like ancient teeth. The air was different here, not just cool and dry like the first vault, but heavy with the weight of centuries, carrying scents of earth and stone and something else that Harold couldn't identify. The tunnel ended at another door, this one made of iron, that had been worked by someone who understood both strength and beauty. The surface was covered with symbols that neither Harold nor Margaret recognized, not letters or numbers from any alphabet they knew, but designs that seemed to tell a story in a language that time had forgotten. Some looked like astronomical symbols, others resembled the kind of mystical markings Harold had seen in old books about medieval alchemy. Harold tried the latch, expecting it to be locked or rusted shut after centuries of neglect, but it opened easily, as if it had been regularly maintained. The hinges moved silently, and beyond the door was a room that took their breath away completely. If the first vault had been impressive, this one was overwhelming. The room was larger, maybe 25 feet across, and the ceiling disappeared into shadows above their heads, supported by stone arches that spoke of architectural knowledge that seemed almost beyond human capability. But it wasn't the size that stopped them in their tracks. It was the contents, gold. Everywhere they looked, there was gold. Not just the small bars they'd found in the first room, but chests full of gold coins that caught their flashlight beam and threw it back in dancing reflections across the walls. Golden artifacts that ranged from simple jewelry to elaborate ceremonial pieces that looked like they belonged to royalty. Artwork that incorporated precious metals in ways that made them gleam even in the uncertain light, creating an atmosphere that was almost mystical. But the gold, impressive as it was, wasn't the most striking thing in the room. That honor went to the paintings. The walls were lined with paintings in ornate frames, and even Harold's untrained eye could tell that these weren't the work of weekend artists or local portrait painters. These were masterpieces, works that seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with their gold leaf frames. Portraits that seemed to follow you with their eyes, landscapes so detailed and lifelike that Harold found himself wanting to step into them. Religious scenes that carried a weight of meaning that transcended their monetary value. Margaret approached one of the paintings, a portrait of a woman in 18th-century dress. The woman's eyes were intelligent and kind, but there was something in her expression that suggested she had seen more of life than most people of her era. The nameplate at the bottom of the frame made Margaret gasp. Portrait of Lady Catherine Whitmore, by Thomas Gainsborough, 1778. "Harold," she whispered, "I think I've heard of Gainsborough. Wasn't he famous? Really famous?" Harold was examining another painting, a battle scene so vivid and detailed that he could almost hear the clash of swords and the screams of horses. The smoke from cannon fire seemed to billow from the canvas, and the expressions on the soldiers' faces were so realistic that they seemed to be pleading for help from across the centuries. The nameplate on this one made his heart skip. The Battle of Culloden by J.M.W. Turner, 1846. Even Harold knew who Turner was. He'd seen reproductions of Turner's work in museums when they'd taken school field trips as children, had watched documentaries about great artists on television. But this wasn't a reproduction hanging in someone's living room. The brushstrokes were visible, three-dimensional, and the paint had the depth and richness that only came from seeing the real thing. "Margaret," he said, his voice strained with disbelief. "I think we need to sit down." They found a wooden crate that seemed sturdy enough to hold their weight and sat side by side in the middle of the treasure room. Harold's flashlight playing across walls lined with more wealth than most small countries possessed. The silence around them was complete except for their own breathing and the distant sound of rain still pattering against something far above their heads. "How is this possible?" Margaret asked finally. "How does someone accumulate all of this? And why hide it away where no one can see it?" Harold was thinking the same thing. He'd heard stories about wealthy families during the Civil War, hiding their treasures to keep them safe from Union troops, but this went far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just a family's savings hidden away during wartime. This was a collection that must have taken generations to assemble, representing more than just money, but knowledge, taste, and connections that spanned continents and centuries. As they sat there, trying to process what they were seeing, Harold noticed something he'd missed in his initial excitement. In the far corner of the room, almost hidden behind a stack of paintings leaning against the wall, was a desk. Not a treasure or an artifact, but a working desk with papers scattered across its surface and books stacked beside an ornate inkwell that looked like it had been used regularly. He walked over to it, Margaret following close behind. The papers were old but not ancient 19th century, maybe. Written in the careful script of someone who had received a formal education. Harold picked up the top sheet and read the heading aloud. An accounting of the Whitmore collection as of December 31st, 1873. Below the heading was a list that made Harold's hands shake as he continued reading. Gainsborough portraits, 7 items. Valued at $28,000 Turner landscapes. 4 items. Valued at $16,000 Roman artifacts acquired from Italian expedition. 40. 3 items. Valued at $12,000 gold coins. Various European mints. 230. 7 items. Valued at $8,000 Native American ceremonial items. 89 items. Valued at $4,000 medieval manuscripts and illuminated texts. 15 items. Valued at $6,000 Chinese porcelain and jade artifacts. 21 items. Valued at $9,000 Egyptian antiquities from private acquisition. 11 items. Valued at $18,000. The list went on for 3 full pages. Each item carefully catalogued with descriptions, acquisition dates, and estimated values. At the bottom, in the same careful script, was a total that made Harold sit down hard in the desk chair. Total estimated value, $147,600. Jesus Christ, Harold breathed. That's in 1870, $3. Margaret, do you have any idea what this would be worth today? Margaret was reading over his shoulder, her own face pale in the flashlight glow. Harold, if this list is accurate, if even half of what we're seeing is real. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Harold was already doing rough calculations in his head. $147,000 in 1873 would be worth millions today, maybe tens of millions, depending on how the art market had treated these specific pieces over the past century and a half. And that was assuming the collection hadn't grown since 1873, which, based on what they were seeing, it clearly had. Harold picked up another paper from the desk, this one clearly more recent. The handwriting was different, more modern, and the date at the top made his pulse quicken. September 15, 1998. Last inventory update. Harold read aloud. Collection has grown significantly since grandfather's passing in 1891. Conservative estimate of current value, $37 million. Note: consider consulting with auction house regarding disposition. Family line ending with me. No heirs. Cannot bear to see collection dispersed without proper appreciation. Will continue to maintain for now. Must find worthy successor who understands true value beyond monetary worth. Harold and Margaret looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. $37 million in 1998. With the art market's explosive growth over the past 25 years, with the increasing rarity of authentic pieces and the global demand from new collectors, the collection could easily be worth twice that now. Maybe more, maybe much more. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the second vault, finding treasures that seemed to come from every corner of the world and every period of recorded history. There were Native American artifacts that looked like they had been carefully preserved rather than looted pottery and weapons and ceremonial objects that spoke of deep respect rather than casual acquisition. There were European pieces that looked like they had come from royal collections, ornate clocks and jeweled daggers, and small paintings that even Harold could recognize as museum-quality works. There were books, not just rare volumes, but collections of manuscripts that looked like they contained knowledge that had been lost to the world. Medieval texts written in Latin and Greek, scientific treatises from the Renaissance, philosophical works that had shaped human thinking for centuries. Some were so delicate that Harold was afraid to breathe on them, bound in materials that seemed to glow with their own internal light. But it was, as they were preparing to leave, that Margaret made the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. She was examining a small writing desk in the corner, not because it looked particularly valuable compared to the treasures surrounding it, but because it seemed oddly out of place among the grander pieces. It was simple, functional, the kind of desk a person might use for everyday correspondence rather than important documents. In the desk's single drawer, she found a letter. The envelope was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Inside, written in the same modern handwriting they'd seen on the recent inventory, was a letter dated just 6 months ago. "Harold," Margaret said, her voice strange, "you need to hear this." She began to read aloud. "My name is Cornelius Whitmore, and I am the last direct descendant of Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore, the man who began this collection in the early 1800s. I am dying, and I have no children, no heirs, no family to whom I can leave this burden. For 150 years, the Whitmore family has been the guardian of this collection. We have added to it, protected it, and kept it secret from a world that would not understand its true value. This is not mere wealth, this is history. Every piece in these rooms tells a story, preserves a memory, maintains a connection to the past that money alone cannot measure. My great-great-grandfather, Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore, was not just a plantation owner, though that is how history remembers him. He was an explorer, a scholar, a man who understood that the greatest treasures were not gold or silver, but knowledge and beauty, and the artifacts that connected us to our shared human heritage. He traveled the world, not to conquer or exploit, but to preserve and protect. During the Civil War, when so much was being destroyed, he used his wealth and connections to save what he could. When native tribes were being displaced and their sacred objects scattered, he purchased them not to display as trophies, but to keep them safe until they could be returned to their proper guardians. When European collections were being broken up and sold, he acquired pieces not for personal glory, but because he believed they deserved to be preserved together. Each generation of our family has continued this work. We have been curators, not owners, guardians, not collectors. We have maintained this collection in secret because we understood that the world was not ready for it, that it would be broken up and scattered to private collectors who cared only for prestige or profit. I had hoped to find a museum, a university, some institution that would understand what we have preserved here and continue our family's mission. But in my failing health, battling cancer that the doctors say will take me within months, I have run out of time. I have made arrangements for the plantation to appear abandoned, for the collection to remain hidden until someone worthy discovers it. If you are reading this, then you are that someone. The collection, by right of discovery, and by my final wish, is yours, but with it comes a responsibility. These treasures are not meant to make their finder rich, they are meant to make the world richer. Use them wisely. Honor the trust that has been placed in you. Find a way to share their beauty and their stories with those who will appreciate them for more than their monetary value. I pray that you will prove worthy of this inheritance. The letter was signed simply, Cornelius Whitmore, last guardian of the Whitmore collection, February 14, 2024. Harold and Margaret sat in stunned silence, the letter between them like a bridge connecting their desperate present to an unimaginable future. They weren't just squatters who had stumbled onto hidden treasure. According to this letter, a legal document, if Cornelius Whitmore had been competent when he wrote it, they were now the official guardians of one of the most significant private art and artifact collections in American history. But with that realization came a crushing weight of responsibility. What were two elderly people with no money, no legal expertise, and no knowledge of the art world supposed to do with treasures that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars? How were they supposed to honor the trust of a man they'd never met, continue a mission that had been maintained by an entire family for more than a century? There's more, Margaret said quietly, reaching into the desk drawer. She pulled out a thick manila folder tied with a ribbon, legal documents, wills, trusts, property deeds, insurance papers. Harold opened the folder with trembling hands. The documents inside were complex, filled with legal language that he couldn't fully understand, but the basic structure was clear. Cornelius Whitmore had established a trust, naming whoever discovered the collection as its beneficiary and guardian. The plantation itself, along with all its contents, would legally belong to them, but with specific stipulations about preservation and eventual public access. There were also detailed records of each piece in the collection: photographs, provenance documentation, expert appraisals, insurance valuations. As Harold flipped through page after page of documentation, one number kept appearing: current estimated value, $256 million. $256 million. Harold set the folder down carefully, as if it might explode if handled roughly. Margaret was staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before, not quite disbelief, not quite fear, but something that encompassed both and more. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" she whispered. Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but Margaret, I don't think we can walk away from this. Even if we wanted to, even if we tried to pretend we never found it, someone else would eventually discover it. And they might not care about preserving it or sharing it with the world." As they made their way back through the tunnel, through the first vault, and up the stairs to the main house, Harold and Margaret carried more than just the knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. They carried the weight of becoming custodians of history itself, inheritors of a responsibility that had been maintained by 5 generations of the Whitmore family. Outside, the rain had stopped, and afternoon sunlight was beginning to filter through the clouds, but neither of them noticed the weather. They were both thinking about the letter, about Cornelius Whitmore's final wish, about what it meant to be given guardianship of something so valuable that its true worth couldn't be measured in dollars alone. The rest of the day passed in a blur of discovery and revelation. They found Cornelius Whitmore's private study on the 2nd floor of the main house, a room that had clearly been lived in recently. His personal belongings were still there: reading glasses on the desk, medications in the bathroom, clothes in the wardrobe that spoke of a man who had lived quietly but comfortably in his final years. But more importantly, they found his research. Boxes of files containing correspondence with museums, universities, and private collectors around the world. Letters from historians begging for access to specific pieces, offers from auction houses that would have made them wealthy beyond imagination, and detailed plans for eventually establishing a museum that would house the collection permanently. He spent his whole life trying to figure out what to do with this, Margaret said, reading through a folder of rejected proposals from various institutions. Every major museum in the world wanted pieces of this collection, but he wouldn't break it up. Harold was examining a series of photographs that showed the collection as it had existed over the decades. Some of the pictures were clearly from the 1800s, formal studio portraits of family members posed with their treasures. Others were more recent, showing Cornelius himself as a young man, then middle-aged, then elderly, always surrounded by the artifacts his family had spent generations protecting. In one photograph, taken perhaps 20 years ago, an aged Cornelius stood beside the Turner battle scene they'd admired earlier. His expression was proud but melancholy, like a man who understood the weight of his inheritance and wasn't sure he was strong enough to carry it alone. "Look at this," Margaret said, holding up a letter dated just 2 years earlier. "It's from the Smithsonian. They're offering to take the entire collection, house it permanently, give the family full credit and control over how it's displayed." Harold read over her shoulder. The letter was respectful, almost reverent in its tone, acknowledging the Whitmore family's stewardship and promising that the collection would be preserved exactly as they had maintained it. The offer was everything Cornelius seemed to have been looking for. "So why didn't he accept?" Harold asked. Margaret flipped to the next page, where they found Cornelius's draft response, apparently never sent. In it, he explained his concerns. The Smithsonian wanted to separate the collection by type and period, displaying the Native American artifacts in one wing, the European art in another, the historical documents in a third. They would preserve the pieces, but they would destroy the collection's unity, its story, the way each piece related to the others to create a greater whole. He understood something that the experts didn't, Margaret said softly. "This isn't just a bunch of valuable things that happen to be stored together. It's a complete collection, a coherent vision of human history and achievement. Breaking it up would be like tearing pages out of a book." As evening approached, Harold and Margaret found themselves in what had been Cornelius's library, surrounded by his personal books and journals. Many of the journals detailed his struggles with the collection's future, his growing illness, and his desperate search for someone who would understand what his family had created. One entry, dated less than a year ago, particularly moved them. "I am the end of the line. My cancer grows stronger while I grow weaker, and I have no children to carry on our family's mission. I have considered donating everything to museums, but they want to scatter the pieces like seeds on the wind. I have considered selling to private collectors, but they would hide these treasures away even more completely than we have, displaying them only to impress their wealthy friends. Perhaps I am being selfish, holding on to something that belongs to the world. But I cannot bear the thought of breaking apart what 6 generations of Whitmores have built together. If there is justice in this world, if there is someone out there who will understand what we have preserved and why it matters, then perhaps they will find us when the time is right. I pray that I will know them when I see them. I pray that they will prove worthy of this trust." Harold closed the journal and looked around the library, filled with books on history, art, archaeology, and preservation. This wasn't the study of a wealthy man showing off his possessions. This was the workspace of a scholar, someone who had devoted his life to understanding and protecting the treasures his family had accumulated. "He was waiting for us," Margaret said quietly. Harold nodded. "Not us, specifically, but people like us. People who would stumble onto this place out of desperation, who would see it as more than just valuable objects to be sold." Outside, the sun was setting over the Georgia countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Harold of some of the paintings they'd seen in the hidden vault. They sat together on the front porch of the Plantation house, watching the day fade into evening, both of them changed by what they'd discovered. They were no longer homeless elderly people looking for shelter. They were the inheritors of a responsibility that spanned generations, the newest guardians of a collection that represented more than money could measure. They had been given a trust that could change not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who would someday have the chance to experience the beauty and wonder of what the Whitmore family had preserved. But first, they had to figure out how to survive long enough to honor that trust. And as Harold looked out at the approaching darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that their biggest challenges were yet to come. Hidden treasures, he was learning, were hidden for a reason. And sometimes the people who had hidden them weren't the only ones who knew where to look. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The third morning dawned clear and bright, with a kind of crystalline Georgia sunlight that made even abandoned places look touched by magic. Harold woke before Margaret, as had become his habit, and made his quiet way downstairs to start coffee and think about their increasingly complex situation. The old house felt different now that they understood what lay beneath it, not just a shelter, but a sanctuary holding more history than most museums would see in a lifetime. They had been living in the Plantation house for almost a week now, and with each passing day, the magnitude of what they'd discovered became more overwhelming. The Whitmore collection wasn't just valuable, it was historically significant in ways that Harold was only beginning to understand. The previous evening, Margaret had found another leather-bound journal hidden in a hollowed-out book in Cornelius's library, and the contents had kept them both awake long into the night. The journal belonged to Colonel Jeremiah Whitmore himself, written in his own careful hand between 1861 and 1872. It detailed not just the contents of his collection, but the extraordinary stories behind many of the pieces. The Gainsborough portraits weren't just paintings by a famous artist, they were lost works that art historians had been searching for decades, pieces that had been presumed destroyed during the London Blitz of World War II. The Native American artifacts weren't just collectibles acquired during westward expansion, they were sacred objects that had been rescued from unscrupulous traders and preserved with meticulous care, complete with detailed notes about their tribal origins and ceremonial significance. Colonel Whitmore had worked with tribal leaders, not against them, creating what might have been the first ethical collection of indigenous artifacts in American history. The Turner battle scene that had so impressed Harold wasn't just a masterpiece by a renowned artist, it was a commission that told a deeply personal story. According to Jeremiah's notes, the painting had been commissioned by Lord Macdonald of Sleat, a Scottish nobleman whose son had died at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. The painting wasn't just art, it was a father's memorial to his lost child, a way of ensuring that the boy's sacrifice would never be forgotten. Harold sipped his coffee and stared out at the overgrown gardens, trying to wrap his mind around the responsibility they'd inherited. They weren't just sitting on a fortune, they were the guardians of pieces of history that museums around the world had given up for lost. Stories that deserved to be told, artifacts that belonged to communities that had thought them lost forever, artworks that could inspire and educate generations of people who would never otherwise have the chance to see them. "Good morning," Margaret said, appearing in the doorway in her robe and slippers. Robe? She looked like she hadn't slept much either, and Harold suspected he knew why. The weight of what they'd discovered was enough to keep anyone awake. "Bad dreams?" he asked, offering her the cup of coffee he'd prepared. She nodded, settling into the chair across from him. "I keep thinking about that Turner painting, the one of Culloden. In the journal, Jeremiah wrote that Lord Macdonald spent his entire fortune commissioning it, that he died penniless because he'd given everything to create a memorial for his son, and now it's sitting in a hidden room under a house in Georgia." Harold finished. Margaret stared into her coffee cup as if she might find answers in its dark surface. "It doesn't seem right. These things, they have meaning beyond their value. They're part of people's stories, their heritage. They shouldn't be hidden away, even if we're trying to protect them." Harold had been thinking the same thing. The more they learned about the collection, the more uncomfortable he became with the idea of keeping it secret. Yes, Cornelius Whitmore had made them the legal guardians, but what gave anyone the right to hide pieces of history from the world? What good was preservation if the preserved objects couldn't fulfill their purpose of educating and inspiring? Maybe we need to start thinking about how to do this right, he said carefully. How to honor Cornelius's wishes, while also making sure these treasures can serve their proper purpose. Before Margaret could respond, they heard the sound of a car engine coming up the long driveway. Harold's blood turned cold. In the week they'd been at the plantation, they hadn't seen another soul. The house was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the road was so overgrown that most people probably didn't even realize it led anywhere. Harold moved quickly to the kitchen window and peered through the trees. A black SUV was making its way slowly up the drive, moving carefully as if the driver was unfamiliar with the road. Behind it came another vehicle, then a third. This wasn't a lost tourist or a curious local, this was a convoy. "Margaret," Harold called quietly. "We've got company." She joined him at the window, and together they watched as 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of the house. The vehicles looked official, expensive, the kind that government agencies or high-end security firms used. Harold counted at least 6 people emerging from the cars, all of them wearing dark clothing and moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military or law enforcement training. But something about their movements didn't feel right to Harold. He'd served in Vietnam, had worked construction sites with security guards, had seen real federal agents during the few times his contracting business had dealt with government projects. These people moved like soldiers, but there was something predatory about their coordination that made his skin crawl. A woman in her 40s stepped out of the lead vehicle, wearing a business suit that looked expensive even from a distance. She had short blonde hair and carried herself with an authority that seemed practiced, rehearsed. Beside her emerged a man about the same age, also formally dressed, but hanging back slightly as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever they were here to do. The woman approached the front door and knocked, not the tentative knock of someone unsure if anyone was home, but the firm, authoritative knock of someone who knew exactly where they were and why they were there. Harold looked at Margaret, both of them thinking the same thing. How could anyone possibly know they were here? They'd told no one, used no credit cards, made no phone calls. They'd been completely off the grid since leaving their foreclosed home. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered. "Answer it," Harold said, though his voice carried more confidence than he felt. "We haven't done anything wrong. We're just 2 old people who needed a place to stay." Harold opened the door to find the woman holding what looked like an official badge. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson?" she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that might have been European. "My name is Agent Sarah Collins, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is Dr. James Harrison from the Smithsonian Institution. We'd like to talk to you about some artifacts that may be located on this property." Harold felt his stomach drop like a stone, but he tried to keep his expression neutral. How could they possibly know about the artifacts? How could they know Harold and Margaret's names? "I'm sorry, you must have us confused with someone else," he said carefully. "We're just staying here temporarily." Agent Collins smiled. But there was nothing warm about the expression. It was the kind of smile a predator might wear while stalking prey. "Mr. Peterson, we know you've been living here for 6 days. We know you drove here from Macon after your house was foreclosed upon. And we know you've discovered the Whitmore collection." The words hit Harold like physical blows. How was any of this possible? He and Margaret had been so careful, so quiet. They hadn't contacted anyone, hadn't left any trail that could be followed. Yet these people seemed to know everything about their situation, down to details that should have been impossible to obtain. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," Harold managed, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "Dr. Harrison stepped forward, and Harold could see that the man was nervous, uncomfortable. "Mr. Peterson, the Whitmore collection, contains several artifacts that are of significant cultural importance to various Native American tribes. Some of those artifacts were acquired through questionable means in the 19th century. We're here to help resolve some historical injustices. And, Agent Collins added, her tone becoming harder, there are questions about whether Mr. Cornelius Whitmore had the legal right to dispose of the collection as he did. Family members are contesting his final wishes. Harold's head was spinning. Family members? But Cornelius Whitmore's letter had specifically stated that he was the last of his line, with no heirs. Either these people were lying, or there were things about the Whitmore family that Harold and Margaret didn't understand. I think we need to see some identification, Margaret said, appearing beside Harold at the door. Her voice was steadier than his, and Harold was grateful for her presence. Real identification, not just badges that could be printed anywhere. Agent Collins and Dr. Harrison both produced credentials that looked legitimate, but Harold had seen enough detective shows to know that false identification could be remarkably convincing. More troubling was the fact that neither of their stories made complete sense. Why would fish and wildlife be involved with historical artifacts? Why would the Smithsonian send someone to make claims about contested property without going through proper legal channels? May we come in? Agent Collins asked. But it wasn't really a question. She was already moving toward the door, and Harold could see the other members of her team positioning themselves around the house. This conversation would be better conducted privately. Harold and Margaret exchanged glances. They didn't really have a choice. If these people were legitimate federal agents, refusing to cooperate would only make their situation worse. If they weren't legitimate, and Harold was growing more certain that they weren't, then they were already in serious danger. They led their visitors into the main parlor, where dust covers still draped most of the furniture. The room felt different with strangers in it, less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. Harold noticed that Agent Collins was studying everything carefully, her eyes lingering on details that someone conducting an official investigation shouldn't necessarily notice. The quality of the woodwork, the age of the furnishings, the subtle signs that the house contained far more value than its abandoned appearance suggested. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, Dr. Harrison began, settling into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. We understand that you're in a difficult situation. Your recent financial troubles, the loss of your home, these are circumstances that might lead people to make decisions they wouldn't normally make. We haven't stolen anything, Harold said quickly. We found a letter from Cornelius Whitmore stating that whoever discovered the collection would become its guardian. Agent Collins leaned forward, her expression becoming almost sympathetic. Mr. Peterson, that letter isn't legally binding. Mr. Whitmore was suffering from advanced cancer and was heavily medicated in his final months. He wasn't competent to make decisions about the disposition of such valuable assets. More importantly, Dr. Harrison added, some of the items in the collection were never legally owned by the Whitmore family in the first place. They're stolen property, Mr. Peterson. Cultural artifacts taken from Native American tribes, artworks looted during wartime, archaeological treasures removed from their countries of origin without permission. Possession of stolen property, regardless of how you acquired it, is a federal crime. Harold felt the room spinning around him. Everything they thought they understood about their situation was crumbling. The letter that had seemed like salvation was being dismissed as the product of a diseased mind. The collection that had seemed like a gift from Providence was being described as stolen goods, and they were sitting in the middle of it all, like criminals caught red-handed. What do you want from us? Margaret asked, her voice carefully controlled. Cooperation, Agent Collins said smoothly. We need you to show us the collection, help us catalog everything that's here. In exchange, we can make sure that you're not charged with any crimes. You're clearly victims of circumstance, not malicious actors. Harold wanted to believe them. These people seemed professional, official, legitimate. Their story had enough truth in it to be plausible. He knew enough about art theft and cultural appropriation to understand that many museum collections contained objects of questionable provenance. but something in Agent Collins's expression reminded him of the bank representatives who had foreclosed on his house, polite, reasonable people who were nonetheless taking everything he'd worked for. "Can we have some time to think about this?" he asked. "Of course," Dr. Harrison said quickly. "But Mr. Peterson, time is a factor here. The longer this situation remains unresolved, the more complicated it becomes for everyone involved. We can return tomorrow morning for your decision." Agent Collins stood to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Mr. Peterson, I hope you'll choose to do the right thing. There are people who have been looking for some of these artifacts for a very long time. People who can be patient, but not indefinitely patient." After the visitors left, their black SUVs disappearing down the overgrown driveway like shadows dissolving in sunlight, Harold and Margaret sat in stunned silence in the parlor. Everything had changed in the span of 30 minutes. Their sanctuary had become a trap, their treasure had become evidence, and they had become criminals, or at least people who might be treated as criminals if they made the wrong choice. "Do you believe them?" Margaret asked finally. Harold shook his head slowly. "I don't know what to believe anymore. But Margaret, what if they're right? What if some of that collection really is stolen property? What if we've been sitting on artifacts that belong to museums or tribes or other countries?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where the SUVs had been parked. "Harold, did you notice anything strange about those people? You mean besides the fact that they knew we were here? I mean the way they moved, the way they looked at the house. That woman, Agent Collins, she wasn't looking at this place like a federal agent investigating stolen property. She was looking at it like someone evaluating its worth." Harold joined her at the window, following her gaze across the overgrown grounds. Margaret was right. There had been something predatory about the way Collins had studied their surroundings, something that went beyond professional interest, and Dr. Harrison had seemed nervous, uncomfortable, like someone who wasn't entirely sure he was doing the right thing. "You think they're not who they say they are?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that we need to be very careful about who we trust." That afternoon, Harold made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He drove to the nearest town with decent cell phone reception, a 30-minute journey down winding country roads, and used a payphone to call information. He needed to verify what they'd been told, needed to understand whether Agent Collins and Dr. Harrison were legitimate federal employees or something else entirely. The conversation he had with the Fish and Wildlife Service's regional office was illuminating. They had no Agent Sarah Collins on their roster, no investigation into artifacts on private property in rural Georgia, no knowledge of any federal interest in the Whitmore Plantation. When Harold described the woman who had claimed to represent them, the supervisor he spoke to became concerned enough to transfer him to their law enforcement division. The law enforcement officer was even more helpful. Not only did they have no Agent Collins, but they provided Harold with a fax number where he could send a description of the people who had visited him. Within an hour, he received a response that made his blood run cold. The woman calling herself Agent Collins was actually Sarah Meridian, a private recovery specialist who worked for wealthy collectors seeking to acquire specific pieces for their private collections. She had been involved in at least 3 cases where valuable artifacts had mysteriously disappeared from archaeological sites or small museums, always with some plausible legal justification that later proved to be fabricated. Dr. Harrison was real. He did work for the Smithsonian, but in a junior capacity, and he was known to moonlight for private collectors who wanted to add legitimacy to questionable acquisitions. The combination of a fake federal agent and a legitimate but corrupt academic was a classic pattern used by high-end art thieves. Harold drove back to the plantation with his hands shaking and his mind racing. They weren't dealing with legitimate federal investigators. They were dealing with criminals, sophisticated, well-funded criminals, who specialized in stealing cultural treasures from people who couldn't fight back. When he shared this information with Margaret, she listened with growing horror and anger. "They're treasure hunters," she said flatly. Professional thieves who were planning to steal everything and leave us to take the blame. But how did they know we were here? Harold asked. How did they know about the collection? The answer came to them that evening, as they were preparing for bed in the master bedroom. Margaret was looking through Cornelius Whitmore's papers again, searching for anything that might explain their situation, when she found a folder they had missed before. Inside were letters from various auction houses, museums, and private collectors, all expressing interest in acquiring pieces from the Whitmore collection. But one letter stood out from the rest. It was from Meridian Acquisitions, dated just 8 months earlier, offering to facilitate the discreet disposition of select items from your collection to discerning private collectors who would appreciate their true value. The letter was signed by Sarah Meridian, the same woman who had claimed to be Agent Collins. "They've been watching this place," Margaret said, her voice hollow with realization. Cornelius knew about the collection, and they've been waiting for an opportunity to get their hands on it. Harold felt sick to his stomach. Cornelius Whitmore had spent his final months trying to find worthy guardians for his family's collection, and instead he had attracted the attention of criminals who saw only dollar signs. "They probably have the whole place under surveillance," he said. "They know we're here alone. They know we don't have money for lawyers or security, and they think they can intimidate us into handing everything over." That night, Harold didn't sleep in the master bedroom. Instead, he sat in the kitchen with his old service pistol .45 he'd carried in Vietnam and kept cleaned and loaded ever since, positioned where he could see both the front and back entrances to the house. Margaret tried to convince him to come to bed, but he shook his head. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back. And when they come, they won't be pretending to be federal agents anymore." Around 3 in the morning, Harold's vigilance was rewarded. He heard the soft sound of vehicles approaching not up the main driveway, but through the woods, engines muffled and headlights extinguished. Through the kitchen window, he could see dark shapes moving between the trees, at least 4 people approaching the house from different directions. These weren't the well-dressed professionals who had visited that afternoon. These were tactical operators, dressed in black and moving with the silent precision of people accustomed to violence. One of them was carrying what looked like a large duffel bag, probably filled with tools for breaking into the house quietly. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands were steady as he picked up his pistol and moved through the house to wake Margaret. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the intruders reached the house, 5 minutes to decide whether to run or fight. Margaret was already awake, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. "They're here, aren't they?" she whispered. Harold nodded. 4 of them, maybe more, coming through the woods. "What do we do?" Harold looked at his wife, this brave, stubborn woman who had shared 50 years of his life, who had followed him into this impossible situation without complaint, who deserved to spend her golden years in peace rather than fighting off criminals in an abandoned plantation house. He thought about the collection beneath their feet, about Cornelius Whitmore's final letter, about the responsibility they had inherited. "We fight," he said simply. "We're not giving up what we've been trusted to protect." Margaret sat up in bed, her eyes reflecting the same determination that had gotten them through 50 years of marriage, 2 children, military service, financial hardship, and every other challenge life had thrown at them. "Then let's fight." The next few minutes would test everything Harold Peterson had learned in 73 years of life, but he was no longer just a homeless old man looking for shelter. He was a guardian, a protector, someone who had been entrusted with preserving something larger than himself. And he would be damned if he was going to let a bunch of high-class thieves steal history itself from under his nose. The sound of breaking glass from the kitchen told him that their time for preparation had run out. The real battle for the Whitmore collection was about to begin, and Harold and Margaret Peterson were the only things standing between $256 million worth of irreplaceable artifacts and the people who would scatter them to private collectors around the world. But sometimes, Harold thought as he checked the safety on his pistol one final time, the most important battles were fought by the most unlikely warriors. As footsteps echoed through the house below them, Harold realized that he and Margaret were no longer just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for memory itself, for the stories that connected humanity to its past, for the sacred trust that had been placed in their weather-beaten hands by a dying man who believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. The war for the Whitmore collection was about to begin, and Harold Peterson intended to win it. The sound of shattering glass from the kitchen window cut through the night silence like a blade. Harold Peterson crouched behind the second-floor banister, his Vietnam-era .45 steady in his hands, despite the arthritis that made every morning a negotiation with pain. Below, he could hear the soft footsteps of at least 3 intruders moving through the plantation house, with the practiced stealth of professionals who had done this kind of work before. Margaret lay flat on the bedroom floor behind him, clutching the cell phone Harold had bought that afternoon after his discovery about their fake federal agents. The signal was weak, this far from town, but she had managed to get through to 911, whispering their location and situation to a dispatcher who seemed to have trouble believing that art thieves were breaking into an abandoned plantation house. "Sheriff's Department is 20 minutes out," Margaret whispered. "State Police maybe 15. Harold nodded grimly. In 15 minutes, professional thieves could load up millions of dollars worth of artifacts and disappear into the Georgia backwoods. They needed help now, not in a quarter hour. But help came from an unexpected direction. The sound of helicopters approaching from the south was so faint at first that Harold thought it might be his imagination. But as the noise grew louder and more distinct, he realized that multiple aircraft were converging on their location, flying low and fast. Then came the sound of vehicles, not the muffled engines of the thieves' SUVs, but the roar of powerful trucks moving at high speed down the plantation's main driveway. Brilliant white light suddenly flooded the grounds around the house as helicopter-mounted searchlights illuminated the night. A voice boomed through a megaphone, so loud it seemed to shake the old house's windows. "Federal agents, you are surrounded. Exit the building immediately with your hands visible." Below, Harold heard scrambling, cursing, and the sound of someone trying to force open the front door from the inside. The thieves had come prepared to break in quietly, but they clearly hadn't expected to need an exit strategy under federal surveillance. Harold moved to the window and peered through the curtains. The plantation grounds were swarming with agents in tactical gear, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and clear command structure. These weren't local sheriff's deputies or even state police, these were federal agents, and they had arrived with overwhelming force. A new voice came through the megaphone, calmer and more professional than the first. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, this is Agent Maria Santos with the FBI's art crime team. Please remain in the house. We have the situation under control." Art crime team? Harold had never heard of such a thing, but as he watched the agents move through the grounds with practiced efficiency, he realized that Sarah Meridian and her crew had picked the wrong target. Whatever had brought the FBI here, they weren't treating this as a simple breaking and entering. They were treating it as a federal crime of significant importance. The confrontation below was brief and decisive. Within minutes, Harold heard the distinctive sound of zip-tie restraints being applied and the monotone recitation of Miranda rights. Through the window, he could see 4 people in black tactical gear being led away in handcuffs, including a woman whose blonde hair was visible even in the harsh glare of the searchlights. Sarah Meridian had finally overplayed her hand. 20 minutes later, Harold and Margaret found themselves sitting in their own kitchen, now illuminated by portable floodlights. The FBI had set up in the yard, across from 2 agents, who looked like they'd been driving all night to get here. Agent Maria Santos was a compact woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that came from dealing with high-stakes situations regularly. Dr. Patricia Williams was younger, maybe 35, and introduced herself as a specialist in art recovery and cultural heritage protection. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," Agent Santos began, "we owe you an apology. We've been tracking Sarah Meridian and her organization for the better part of 2 years, but we were always one step behind. When we learned that she was moving on the Whitmore collection, we thought we were too late. Dr. Williams opened a thick folder and pulled out several photographs. Meridian Acquisitions isn't just a group of art thieves, they're a sophisticated criminal organization that specializes in acquiring high-value cultural artifacts for wealthy private collectors who don't ask questions about provenance. They've been responsible for the theft of millions of dollars worth of artwork and historical artifacts across 3 continents. Harold studied the photographs, which showed various crime scenes where priceless artifacts had been stolen from museums, archaeological sites, and private collections. How did you know about this place? About the collection? Agent Santos exchanged glances with Dr. Williams before answering. Mr. Peterson, the Whitmore collection has been on our radar for decades. We knew it existed, and we knew it was significant, but the family had always refused any kind of official contact. They maintained their privacy, paid their taxes, and never gave us any reason for concern. But about 6 months ago, Dr. Williams continued, we started getting intelligence that various criminal organizations were showing interest in this area. Phone intercepts, financial records, surveillance reports, all pointing to something big happening in rural Georgia. Margaret leaned forward. You were watching us? Not you specifically, Agent Santos assured her. We were watching for Meridian's team. When they made their move yesterday with fake credentials, we knew it was time to act. We just didn't expect to find the collection already had new guardians. Dr. Williams pulled out another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. Mr. Peterson, we've reviewed Cornelius Whitmore's final arrangements. His legal documentation is thorough and legitimate. The collection, along with the property, legally belongs to you and your wife. Harold felt the room spinning around him again, but this time it wasn't from fear or confusion. It was from relief so overwhelming it threatened to knock him over. You mean we're not criminals? We're not going to be arrested for possession of stolen property? Agent Santos smiled, the first genuine smile Harold had seen from anyone in authority in longer than he could remember. Mr. Peterson, you're not criminals. You're the legal guardians of one of the most significant private art collections in American history. And frankly, after what you've been through to protect it, I'd say you've earned that title. The next several hours passed in a blur of questions, explanations, and revelations that reshaped everything Harold and Margaret thought they knew about their situation. The FBI's art crime team, they learned, was a specialized unit that dealt exclusively with cultural property theft, art forgery, and the protection of historical artifacts. Dr. Williams had a PhD in art history and had spent the last decade working to recover stolen cultural treasures and return them to their rightful owners. The Whitmore collection is unique, Dr. Williams explained as they toured the hidden vaults by flashlight, her voice filled with professional excitement. Most private collections are assembled haphazardly, based on personal taste or investment potential. But this is a systematic preservation of cultural heritage spanning multiple continents and centuries. She stopped in front of the Turner battle scene, studying it with an expert's eye. This painting was commissioned as a memorial, but it's also a historical document. Turner painted it based on first-hand accounts from survivors of the battle. It's one of the few contemporary artistic representations of Culloden that exists. Agent Santos was examining the Native American artifacts with equal reverence. Colonel Whitmore's correspondence with tribal leaders shows that he wasn't collecting these as trophies. He was preserving them during a period when the federal government was actively trying to destroy Native American culture. Some of these pieces are the only surviving examples of their kind. As they explored deeper into the collection, Harold began to understand something that hadn't been clear from Cornelius's letters or even his detailed journals. The Whitmore family hadn't just been wealthy collectors, they had been pioneering conservationists, using their resources to preserve cultural heritage at a time when most people saw historical artifacts only as curiosities or investments. The family correspondence shows that they worked with museums, universities, and cultural institutions around the world, Dr. Williams said, pulling out a folder of letters dating back to the 1880s. They loaned pieces for research, funded archaeological expeditions, and supported scholars who couldn't afford to acquire materials for their studies. But they never went public. Agent Santos added, they maintained the collection privately, making it available to legitimate researchers while keeping it away from those who might exploit it for commercial purposes. Margaret had been quiet during most of the tour, but she finally spoke up as they stood in the center of the second vault, surrounded by treasures that represented the cultural heritage of humanity itself. What happens now? Are we supposed to continue what they were doing? How are two elderly people with no training supposed to manage something like this? Dr. Williams smiled. Mrs. Peterson, you're not alone in this. The FBI's art crime team works with legitimate cultural institutions all the time. If you're willing, we can help you establish the proper legal and organizational framework to turn the Whitmore collection into a permanent institution. Over the following days, Harold and Margaret found themselves at the center of a controlled whirlwind of activity. Art experts, legal scholars, museum professionals, and cultural heritage specialists descended on the plantation not as invaders, but as collaborators eager to help preserve what the Whitmore family had protected for generations. The legal process was complex but straightforward. Cornelius Whitmore's estate documents had been meticulously prepared, with trust arrangements that not only transferred ownership to whoever discovered the collection, but also provided funding for its maintenance and eventual public display. Hidden bank accounts, managed by discreet financial firms for decades, contained more than enough money to establish and operate a world-class museum. He thought of everything, Jennifer Mason told them during one of her visits to review the legal arrangements. The young attorney had become something of a specialist in cultural property law almost overnight, working with federal experts to ensure that Harold and Margaret's guardianship was legally bulletproof. Mr. Whitmore established multiple backup plans, financial safeguards, even architectural specifications for a purpose-built museum. The architectural plans, discovered in Cornelius's personal files, were breathtaking. Working with museum designers and historical preservation experts, he had spent years developing plans for a facility that would house the collection while maintaining the historical integrity of the plantation grounds. The museum would be built into the hillside behind the main house, mostly underground, with climate-controlled galleries connected by the same tunnels that had hidden the collection for generations. Harold stood in what would become the museum's main entrance, watching construction crews carefully excavate the hillside, according to specifications that had been drawn up decades before he and Margaret had ever heard of the Whitmore family. It's like he knew exactly who we were going to be and what we were going to need, he said to Margaret. She nodded, studying the architectural drawings that showed how the underground galleries would connect to create a seamless visitor experience. He understood something about legacy that most people never figure out. It's not about being remembered, it's about making sure the important things survive. The construction process took 18 months, but Harold and Margaret were never idle during that time. They worked with Dr. Williams and a team of curators to catalog every piece in the collection, researching provenance, historical significance, and optimal display conditions. They traveled to museums around the world, learning about best practices in conservation and public education. They also made difficult but important decisions about pieces that belonged elsewhere. Several Native American artifacts were returned to tribal councils with full documentation of their history and significance. Some European pieces were transferred to museums in their countries of origin, though always with the understanding that they remained part of the Whitmore collection's scholarly legacy. "We're not trying to hoard everything," Harold explained to a reporter from Smithsonian Magazine who visited during the museum's construction. "We're trying to make sure these treasures serve their proper purpose, educating people, preserving culture, connecting us to our shared heritage." The museum opened 3 years after that first desperate night, when Harold and Margaret had sought shelter in an abandoned plantation house. The opening ceremony was attended by art historians, government officials, tribal leaders, and representatives from dozens of museums around the world. But the moment that mattered most to Harold came during the private preview, when he watched a group of school children from the local elementary school explore the galleries with wide-eyed wonder. One little girl, maybe 8 years old, stood transfixed in front of the Gainsborough portrait that had been one of their first discoveries. She studied the painted woman's face with the intense concentration that only children could bring to something that truly captured their imagination. "Did you really find all this hidden under the house?" she asked when Harold approached. Harold knelt down to her level, his 76-year-old knees protesting the fen's movement, but his heart light with purpose. "We did. But you know what the most important thing was? We found it together, and now it belongs to everyone." "Even me?" the girl asked. "Especially you," Harold replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. That evening, as the last visitors left the museum, Harold and Margaret walked through the galleries together, just as they had walked through the hidden vaults during that first week of discovery. But everything was different now. The treasures were no longer hidden. They were displayed with careful lighting and detailed explanations, sharing their stories with anyone who wanted to listen. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked as they paused in front of Colonel Whitmore's portrait, now prominently displayed in the museum's main gallery. "All the attention, all the responsibility, all the work." Harold considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally. "We could have sold everything, taken the money, and disappeared, somewhere warm and comfortable. But money wouldn't have given us what this did." "What's that?" Harold gestured around the gallery, where soft lighting made the artifacts glow like jewels against dark walls. "Purpose, the feeling that our lives mattered for something bigger than ourselves." They had started as two desperate elderly people looking for a place to sleep. They had become the guardians of history, the protectors of stories, the bridge between the past and the future. The grease-stained mechanic and the former county clerk had become the stewards of one of the world's great cultural treasures, but more than that, they had transformed their entire community. The Whitmore Heritage Museum and Learning Center had become a destination that drew visitors from around the world, bringing millions of dollars in tourism revenue to a region that had been economically depressed for decades. Local young people found jobs as tour guides, security guards, and museum technicians. The Plantation House itself had been restored to its original grandeur and now served as an educational center where scholars from around the world came to study the collection and its history. Late that night, Harold stood alone in the master bedroom of the Plantation House, the same room where they'd slept that first night with no idea what lay beneath their feet. Through the windows, he could see the lights of the museum they'd built, and beyond that, the town that had grown up around their discovery. The economic transformation had been remarkable. Hotels, restaurants, and gift shops had opened to serve the steady stream of visitors. A small airport had been expanded to accommodate private jets, bringing wealthy art lovers and cultural tourists. The local school system had been revitalized with donations from grateful visitors and educational programs linked to the museum's resources. But the real change had been in the people themselves. Harold watched the lights in the windows of houses where families lived who had found new opportunities, new purpose, new pride in their community. Children who had grown up expecting to leave rural Georgia for opportunities elsewhere were now staying, building careers around the cultural center that had emerged from what had once been a forgotten corner of the state. Harold pulled out a small wooden box from his bedside table, a simple container that held the key Cornelius Whitmore had left for them, the brass key that had unlocked not just a door, but an entirely new life. He'd had it mounted in a frame now, with a simple inscription: "Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries happen to the most ordinary people." As he prepared for bed, Harold thought about the letter Cornelius Whitmore had left for them, the one that had started everything. The old man had written about responsibility, about the obligation to preserve history for future generations. Harold and Margaret had honored that obligation. They'd taken a collection that had been hidden away and shared it with the world. They'd turned a forgotten plantation into a center of learning and discovery. They'd proved that sometimes, when life knocks you down, the best response is to get back up and build something beautiful. They had found more than treasure in that hidden room. They had found their purpose. The next morning brought news that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. Harold answered a call from the White House. The president wanted to present them with the National Humanities Medal for their work in preserving and sharing American cultural heritage. Margaret took the call from the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, inviting them to speak at a conference on cultural preservation in Paris. But the call that meant the most came from Lisa, their daughter in California. She was bringing her teenage children, Harold and Margaret's grandchildren, to visit the museum and spend Christmas at the Plantation house. For the first time in years, the family would be together in a place they could be proud of, a legacy they had built rather than lost. As Harold stood on the front porch of the Plantation house that morning, watching tour buses full of visitors arrive for another day of discovery and learning, he realized that their story had become larger than just two elderly people who had found hidden treasure. It had become a reminder that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were guided by purpose rather than profit. Margaret joined him on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that had sustained their marriage through 50 years of challenges and triumphs. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Harold accepted the coffee and looked out over the grounds where tourists were already gathering. Children were running between the oak trees, and scholars were arriving for another day of research in the archives they'd established. "I'm thinking about something Cornelius wrote in one of his letters. He said the collection wasn't meant to make its finders rich, it was meant to make the world richer." Margaret nodded. "Do you think we succeeded?" Harold watched a young girl, about the same age as the one who had asked him about the hidden treasure point, excitedly at something in the museum guidebook, her face bright with curiosity and wonder. He saw elderly couples holding hands as they explored galleries full of beauty and history, teenagers taking selfies in front of masterpieces they'd only seen in textbooks, scholars from different continents sharing discoveries and insights. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think we did." Their transformation was complete, but their story was ongoing. Every day brought new visitors, new discoveries, new opportunities to share the treasures they'd been entrusted to protect. Harold and Margaret Peterson had become more than just the guardians of the Whitmore collection. They had become proof that heritage belongs to everyone, that culture is stronger than commerce, and that sometimes the most important legacies are created by people who never expected to leave one. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Georgia hills, warming the stone walls of a house that had sheltered secrets for generations and now shared them with the world, Harold realized that their greatest discovery hadn't been gold or paintings or priceless artifacts. Their greatest discovery had been that it's never too late to find your purpose, and that sometimes the most meaningful treasures are the ones we learn to give away. Anyone can become a guardian of history if they're willing to look beyond their own circumstances and see the larger story they're part of. As the morning sun rises over the Whitmore Museum and Learning Center, Harold Peterson doesn't see a building filled with priceless artifacts. He sees the future children who will grow up inspired by the past, scholars who will uncover new truths, and ordinary people who will discover that history isn't something that happened to other people in other times. It's something they're creating every day. The elderly couple who thought they were just looking for shelter became the protectors of memory itself, because sometimes the most important discoveries aren't the ones we set out to make. They're the ones that find us when we're ready to receive them. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of unexpected discoveries and second chances. Click to continue the journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that extraordinary things can happen to ordinary people.